The First Battle of Bull Run. July 16th, 1861, the Union and Confederate met in Manassas Junction, Virginia, for a major battle of the Civil War. It was a battle of 35,000 Union troops against 20,000 Confederate troops. For the majority of the battle, the Confederates were staying on the defensive. However, they eventually rallied their troops and forced the Union to retreat. This Confederate victory gave the Confederate a confidence boost and made the Union realize that this war would be harder to win than they initially thought it would.
The Second Bull Run Battle, also known as the Second Manassas, took place in northern Virginia in 1862. This Union army was led by Major General George B. McClellan. General McClellan took his army from Washington over water to Virginia to reach Richmond. He landed around Fort Monroe. This plan would allow them to get into Virginia and avoid a gigantic Confederate army. Around April, he was within a few miles of Richmond. By the end of May, General Johnson leads a Confederate army to counterattack the Union army being led by General McClellan. This was the Battle of Seven Pines. General Johnson was injured and his father, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, said General Lee, who was one of the best generals that the Confederate had in command of this army. The battle was won by General Robert Lee.
The Battle of Antietam took place on September 17, 1862, and ended the Confederate invasion of Maryland in 1862 and resulted in a Union victory. It was the bloodiest battle in American history with over 23,000 casualties in roughly 12 hours. The number of soldiers involved from the Union Army were 75,300, and from the Confederate Army, 52,000. The Army of the Potomac, under the command of George McClellan, mounted a series of powerful assaults against Robert E. Lee's forces.
In 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched his second invasion of the Northern Territory. President Abraham Lincoln had lost confidence in the Army of the Potomac's commander, Joseph Hooker, who seemed reluctant to confront Lee's army after the defeat at Chancellorsville on June 28. Lincoln named Major General George Gordon Meade to succeed Hooker. The battle lasted from July 1st to July 3rd, and Confederates attacked Federals on both left and right. And on July 3rd, Lee ordered an attack by fewer than 15,000 troops on the enemy center at Cemetery Ridge. The assault, known as Pickett's Charge, managed to pierce the Union lines but eventually failed at the cost of thousands of rebel casualties, and Lee was forced to withdraw his battered army toward Virginia on July 4th.
During the Civil War, the North had the advantage in just about every possible way, except for the fact that the Confederates had good commanders and they also had better knowledge of the land. Towards the end of the Civil War, the Confederates decided to use the strategy of attrition, which is basically a belligerent attempt to win a war by wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse through continuous losses in personnel and materials. But this would have only helped the North because the North had way more resources and materials than the Confederates did. During this time, Abraham Lincoln was running for president again, but many of the people were not favoring him because they thought that he couldn't end the Civil War. But then General Sherman took Atlanta, and this changed the presidential election in favor of Abraham Lincoln. And a religious point of view was that the Union thought that they had God on their side because they believed that slavery was wrong and they were fighting for freedom for the African Americans. Some say that was a motive for them during the war, but the same thing goes for the Confederates. They thought that they were fighting for their freedom. One thing that both sides had in common was the fact that they wouldn't harm civilians unless they wouldn't cooperate, especially the Confederates. They would never threaten a northern city. The Civil War ended when General Lee surrendered his army to Ulysses S. Grant